My name's Stefan Evans, and I'm the CEO at the Bevan Foundation. And we're really grateful for all of you for joining us this morning for this webinar. For those of you who don't know us, the Bevan Foundation is Wales' most influential think tank, and we work to find long-term solutions to poverty and inequality. And we can only do this thanks to the support of our individual supporters and subscribers. And if you're joining us this morning and your organisation isn't a subscriber to us, please make sure you check out our website to understand a bit more about kind of the work we do, some of the benefits we can offer, and some of the opportunities for yourselves as well in looking at that sort of subscription. In terms of today's session itself, though, however, we this is a great opportunity, we think, before the summer recess to kind of look back maybe at what's been quite a landmark few months in Welsh politics. So, I don't need to tell anyone on this call about how seismic the results in May was in terms of the Senedd election. And in the run-up to that election, we were conscious of that there was a narrative building up maybe about who might be voting for which party and what was motivating people to do particular things. And in particular, we were inspired by some work that the Joseph Rowntree Foundation had done in Scotland, which looked to understand how people had voted, kind of were intending to vote based on their kind of economic position. And with funding for the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, we've been able to work with Jack Larner from Cardiff University and YouGov to get a better sense of how that sort of interaction was panning out in a Welsh context. And we think the findings that we're sharing today in the report published, and Jack will be talking through in a minute, provide a really striking kind of overview, I guess, and an insight into the relationship between people's financial position and their voting behaviours. I'm pleased to be on the panel with us today. So we've got Jack, as I already mentioned, who's going to talk through the findings of the work, and then my colleague Mably Jones, who's head of policy poverty at the Bevan Foundation, who's going to reflect a little bit about what Jack's kind of information means, I guess, for the policy landscape in Wales. But I'm conscious you've not come here to hear me talk about what Jack's going to talk about. So without further ado, I'll hand over to yourself, Jack, to start your presentation.
Great, diolch Steph, diolch Mably and the Bevan Foundation for inviting me along this morning. So Steph says my name's Jack. I'm work at Cardiff University's Welsh Government Centre, and I'm going to talk you through some of the research that I've been doing on their behalf. So I'm going to share my screens now, and if Steph and Mably, you could just give me a thumbs up. You can see the slides. Fab, great. Okay, right, that's fantastic. Okay, so. Yes, working today at economic security in Wales. And like Stefan said, this is based off work first actually by the Nuffield Political Research Centre at University of Oxford, led by Jane Green, funded by the JRF, who looked at this idea of economic security. And we've taken some of their kind of questions and ideas that they've applied both for Britain as a whole and specifically in Scotland, like Steph mentioned, and kind of tailored it to Wales and to look at it here as well. And we did that by a big survey, so a two-wave survey. So that means we interview about 3,800 people about a month apart. So you interview them twice online, and we can kind of build up this picture. And just as what we're going to cover today, some of the questions that the report and the research is interested in. So we're interested in a few things, but first, this idea of who is economically insecure in Wales, how many people feel economically insecure, and how that varies by different age groups and demographic groups, because one of the big findings of the GRF stuff, that age is kind of a real central variable here looking at this kind of stuff. We're also interested in then how this feeling of economic security or other insecurity shapes how people think about politics, their engagement with politics, whether they think they themselves are active participants in politics, whether they feel excluded. We look at how it shaped the most recent Senedd election, like Steph said, a big change election. I suppose it's the cliche now, but it is true, big change election. And then we also look at, I suppose it's linked to that idea of engagement with politics, ideas about the state. Do people who feel economically insecure want the state to change in big and radical ways? We look at constitutional questions there. And finally, we look at kind of preferences in terms of spending. So what essentially people want to do about it. But first, the headline figure. So we asked people basically how we're getting this figure. How worried are you about you and your family's economic security? This is the question used across most Joseph Rowntree Foundation work, and that they use with the Oxford team as well. And we find in Wales that basically 43%, so nearly half of everybody in Wales, of all respondents rather, felt at least fairly worried, with a good 11% they're feeling very, very worried about their and their families' economic security. So we classified these people who say they're fairly worried or very worried, as economically insecure. Now, this is a similar number to what you get in Scotland and in England. It's a little bit higher in Wales, but we do use slightly different methods, so we shouldn't read across it directly. But I think the core thing here is that this is mainstream. This is not a niche, small section of what I would say the electorate, but also many of these people don't vote, right? So it's just of citizens in Wales. This is a core kind of feeling that people have in Wales. And it is subjective. We are asking people about how you feel about it. But if we look at it compared to how does it correlate with other more objective measures? You know, if we look at compared to income, for example, this is household income, you can see we get good validation. That basically means it works as you'd expect. People with lower levels of household income feel far more insecure than people with high levels of household income. And if we dig down into kind of some more specifics in what the reasons why people feel insecure, we asked things about, well, you know, if you had like a £200 emergency bill that come up, so that could be something in the house broke down, right? The car broke down, kind of anything you can kind of think of, would you be able to cover an emergency £200 bill? And we find that basically a quarter say that they just couldn't. They really, really struggle, just be simply unable to cover that. But also, you know, about 40% would feel that was difficult, basically. So they could do it, but it would be a real pinch kind of on their life, on their lifestyle. They'd have to take it out of savings. They might have to sell something else, right? You know, so again, there's an awful lot of people who would struggle to cover these kind of costs, which are not unusual, I'd say, in people's life course. And then also looking forward, we have even more people feel quite uncertain about their retirement. Now, this is going to be a big thing in Wales and across the UK, in fact, across all Western democracies, as we have these aging populations, but in particular in Wales, which is aging faster than everybody else, given some demographic movements and things like this. Essentially half of people in Wales say that they feel pretty worried or they lack confidence in their ability to be secure in their retirement. So again, that's going to be a huge thing over the next 20, 30 years, I think, as well. Again, if we break it down further into what specific things people seem to be worried about, well, the first thing is, and again, nearly half of everyone in Wales feels, is that their household income over the next 12 months. And I think also, if you look at the bottom of this graph there, and relatively few people are concerned about being able to get a job or keeping their job. And this is quite different to what we would actually see in the job market 20 years ago, when rather than be worried about the income you would be sustaining from your job, people would be more worried about losing their job or being able to find a job. That doesn't seem to be a big worry for lots of people here. It's more that once you have a job, that income isn't dependable essentially anymore. And that's, again, I suppose makes sense in terms of things we've seen over the last few years in terms of inflation, cost of living, etc. But also debt levels is another concern for about a quarter of people in Wales, both their current debt levels, so what debt they already have, but also the potential of building up debt over the next few months. And that will be linked to things like that emergency £200 bill we already talked about, or your household income. If that potentially drops over the next 12 months, you might have to build up debt as a result. Now, one of the more striking things that came out of the Joseph Rowntree Foundation research is that age is a very strong predictor of economic security. And basically, across any measure we can possibly ask in these surveys, you find that insecurity peaks at kind of sometime around 30, 35, and then doesn't drop off until you're about 55 or so. So on every measure, so you can see on this on the left-hand side of the graph, most of the shapes of these lines follow like an upside down U curve, where economic insecurity rather, is low lower, I should say, kind of under 30, and then lower again after 60. But it's that peak there when people tend to be accumulating the most outgoings in their lives, right? So it's things like you might have a mortgage, you might be paying a lot more rent if you're in private rented accommodation, things like childcare, as we know at the moment, very politically salient, which is very expensive. I think all the panelists on this are paying childcare at the moment. We can tell you it's very expensive. But you can see these kind of accumulated costs, which don't yet, which lessen over time after a certain age, and also you don't really start acquiring until you're kind of 30s for most people at least. But just to zoom in on this, I think, and focus on this, one thing that I thought was particularly interesting is that this isn't just a story about retirement. So it's not just that when you, for example, qualify for the state pension and you start dipping into your retirement earnings, rather, if you have a private pension as well or an employer-based pension, it's not just that. It does dip off before pension age. So something around 55. And while we don't go into it in this presentation, if you read the report, you will see that one of the biggest predictors is having children in the household. And that tends to also be around the age when children start to move out. Again, focusing specifically on which demographics kind of face the heaviest burden. And it's this consistent, again, the age shape is always the same here. But looking first is social renters, right, especially social renters with no savings. They are one of the most insecure groups in all of Wales. More than 60% there feel economically insecure. If you have very few savings, little savings, again, that's tied to that kind of retirement kind of anxiety. You're likely to feel a lot more insecure there. And a disability, if you are disabled, then again, you have there's much higher levels of insecurity there, again, over 60%. And across every age group, there's essentially, if you're disabled, 15 to 20 points more likely to feel economically insecure. And again, children in the house. So if you have children in the household, economic insecurity doesn't quite double, but it's not too far off there. We can also look at things like welfare receipts. And again, if we want to pick out the single most insecure group in all of Wales by just one kind of factor, it would be people who are in receipt of universal credit. So almost 70%, so 67%, almost 70% of universal credit recipients feel economically insecure there. So it's about 24 points above the Wales average, so much higher than everyone else. But all sorts of different welfare receipts actually are above the Wales average. So housing benefit, child tax credit, PIP, or one of the many various spin-offs of disability benefit. Council tax benefit, this is quite unsurprising, I suppose, right? Given that the threshold for some of these is by definition, you must be economically insecure in some way. But with the one exception there being winter fuel allowance, who are actually recipients of winter fuel allowance are actually quite a lot more secure or feel a lot more secure than the Wales average. This again, of course, will be linked to age. Right, and this is an age-based benefit, and as we saw from the previous graphs, people over age 65 are feel the most secure. That doesn't mean that will continue forever, especially with changes to winter fuel allowance and things, but that is pretty striking, the difference there. Now, that's kind of the demographic spread. Now we can really start to focus on a few things in terms of, how does this relate to politics? Well, one of a series of questions that most election studies tend to ask is to do with efficacy. And this is the idea that, do you think that you are able to shape the political process? So do politicians listen to people like you? Do they care about people like you? Does it matter how you vote? Do you have a say in who gets to form government? That feeling that I have at least some power over the political system, even if it's small or not. Well, perhaps unsurprisingly, there's a kind of a vicious cycle here between being economically insecure and feeling politically powerlessness, or powerless, I should say, powerless. So if we look at, people who basically feel that they have very little say in the political process, that's this red bar on the right-hand side. That's about 47% of economically insecure among that group. Those are people who agree that they have essentially no say. Politicians don't care what they think, and also that you have no say in government, right? People that agree with all these sorts of statements, they are a lot more economically insecure or feel a lot more insecure than people who are not there. Now, I think it's probably quite complicated to say which one causes which. It's probably true that it is a bit of a cycle. You feel economically insecure, and so you feel precarious, and you feel like the state and politics isn't working for you. Therefore, you feel that I have no say in this kind of stuff, and that again likely will increase kind of feelings of insecurity. We also looked at things like democratic satisfaction over time, over different kind of in terms of security, but also in terms of savings here. And again, you can look at almost any subjective or objective measure here that people who feel more insecure and people who have less money and fewer savings are all less satisfied with democracy. So what we have here is the percentage of people who say they're dissatisfied. So higher here means they're more dissatisfied. The blue line is satisfaction or dissatisfaction with the UK government, red with I should say with UK democracy, red with Welsh democracy. And you can see under the bottom, you've got the amount of savings people have. As savings increase, dissatisfaction decreases. So basically, the more money you have, the more wealth you have, the more satisfied you are with democracy. Now, there's always a gap in that people are at every savings level more satisfied with Welsh democracy than they are with UK democracy. In fact, at every level, a majority are dissatisfied with UK democracy. But again, in our discussions with the Bevan Foundation, as we were working through this, I think Steph pointed something out which is very telling, is that, actually the gap between satisfaction with Welsh and UK democracy is highest among people with fewer savings. It's narrowest to people with more savings. Again, something that I think future work could dig into a bit more. Looking as well at 2026. So it's not just this shapes attitudes, it seems to be shaping how people vote in elections. Not just in 2026, but over previous elections, but this is kind of the brand new research we have for 2026. Now, what we've done here is just look at the percentage of kind of people feeling insecure over different categories that we've got here by different vote choice. The key message to take away, I understand there's lots of colors on this graph, so it might not be the easiest, but the key thing to take away here is that it is both Reform UK and Green and Plaid Cymru voters who are the most insecure in Wales. And this, I think, is counter to lots of the media narratives that we've got over the last, not just the last few months leading to the Senedd elections, but the last few years in terms of looking at who Reform UK voters are. This idea that if you go to places with higher economic deprivation, things like this, you'll find that necessarily means you're going to get a lot more Reform voters. It's much more complicated than that. In fact, there's pretty much even levels of insecurity among Reform and Plaid voters. And actually, feeling economically insecure was a really good predictor of moving away from the two old, bigger, established UK-wide parties. So if you felt economically insecure, you were much more likely to move away from Labour and the Conservatives in the last 2 years, and then to either, mostly in Wales, Plaid or Reform. Now, Labour voters still are relatively insecure, but more secure than those other kind of challenger parties. And Conservatives there are the most economically secure. Conservative voters are also the most wealthy. They have the most savings. They have highest incomes. And also, on average, the average group of that age group now is 67. So they're pretty old as an age group. So again, it all links together there. And I think just digging deeper into the kind of how this shapes political attitudes and preferences. Next, we looked at constitutional preferences. So it's quite established in kind of academic literatures across the world that people who feel like they're losing out from the current economic settlement tend to favour quite radical changes to the status quo. And in Wales, one such quite radical change would be a change in constitution quite dramatically. So either abolishing devolution entirely or independence, for example. And if we look at this, again, it's independent supporters are the most economically insecure. So people who feel insecure, rather than driving them again to think we should get rid of devolution altogether, again, I think quite a common trope that we do see in some coverage of Welsh politics, it actually seems to be driving them in the opposite direction towards favouring independence there. So on the graph here, people with most specific kind of worries. Again, you can see among independent supporters, 36% have multiple economic worries compared to just 21% for abolish at the other end of the scale. And again, if you look on the next graph, 50% of independent supporters are worried about their overall economic security, was that being the highest of any of these constitutional preference groups, with the lowest being either the status quo there or abolishing the Senedd there. And again, this is true across the entire age group. So if you look at independent supporters across the entire age group, again, really peaking in that kind of 40 to kind of 55 age range, again, they are more economically insecure there. And we can also drive down on focusing on the two biggest parties, because it's quite strange that you might think, and I think it is counter to a lot of narratives, that both Reform and Plaid voters feel essentially equal levels of equal levels of insecurity there, because their approach to politics is very, very different. So it's not that insecurity drives you in one specific direction. It's that insecurity seems to drive you away from the established parties, but then other things like national identity and other value sets and ideology will determine which direction you go to, whether you go to Plaid or Reform. So if we look here, just among people who feel economically insecure, Reform and Plaid voters. First, in terms of low efficacy, 80% of insecure Reform voters have low efficacy, that feeling of political powerlessness, compared to only 49% of Plaid voters. I say only because the difference is big. Obviously, that's still quite a considerable amount. In terms of dissatisfaction with democracy in Wales, the vast majority of insecure Plaid voters are happy with democracy in Wales. Again, this is a big difference to the Reform voters there. And then for constitutional issues, as we've already looked at, drastically different preferences there as well. So I think just a core message here: insecurity does shape how people vote. It seems to. It does shape how they think about politics, but it does not necessarily determine which kind of a challenger party they'll move towards. Right, that's determined by other things. Finally, and this is the final kind of substantive slide from me, we ask people in terms of welfare spending, because another thing that we tend to see, I think, is the assumption that there would be a lot of support for kind of cutting welfare benefits and things like that. Again, we don't really find that. What we've got here is plotting the percentage of people who want more spending on these different areas of welfare. The green dot is people who don't feel insecure, or they are secure. And the red dot is people who feel insecure. And you can see for everyone, with one exception, there is increased support for more spending on every single welfare type here, compared to people who don't feel insecure. With in fact a majority wanting more spending on pensions, on education, on health in particular. And then you see much smaller gaps when it comes to public transport and police and law enforcement. And then actually, relative to people who don't feel insecure, the economically insecure want less spending on defence. That's the only kind of area where they'd like less spending compared to secure voters there. So finally, from me, just some conclusions. You can hopefully read the report on the Bevan website for the full thing. But again, this isn't just a poverty story. Poverty really is talking about the extreme of this group, right, which is widespread and growing, or has grown in Wales, or that deepened specifically in Wales, as you'll know from people who've read previous Bevan research. But this is just the feeling of economic insecurity is very widespread. It's nearly half of all people in Wales feel that. And it does seem to be really driving political change that we've seen in Wales over the last 2 years. And not just in Wales, actually across Britain as well. More worrying for the state of our democracy. It seems to fuel this idea of alienation. It seems to fuel this idea of political powerlessness. There's no point in me taking part in the process, for example, if I don't feel like my vote or my voice is being heard in politics. Like I said, it's reshaped the electorate. Arguably, one of the big drivers for the biggest electoral change we've seen in Wales for over a century. And the other key thing is that there is not this great feeling of being anti-welfare in the Welsh public. It's a lot more nuanced than that. And actually, in particular, people who feel insecure tend to favour a lot more spending on welfare. So that's it for me. I do have lots of other emergency slides in case of questions later, but otherwise I'll hand back to Steph and Mably. So diolch yn fawr.
Yeah, diolch Jack. And if you could unshare your slides, that would be grand. Diolch yn fawr. Thank you, Jack. Thank you for those of you who sent questions in already. Mary, yeah, we'll make sure we get something across to you as well, Mary. Thanks for that. I'm going to hand over now to my colleague Mably, who's just going to kind of give a bit of reaction from our side, I guess, in terms of the policy implications of this. But please make sure that you continue to send your questions through as well, because we'll have a fair bit of time then after to, yeah, come to those. So, Mably, diolch yn fawr.
Diolch, Steph, and diolch, Jack. I think, yeah, everyone will agree that's really useful. And some of the really useful stuff in it as well, I think, is the bits that challenge some of the assumptions that we have, or some of the sort of media narratives that we've seen over recent years. And I think in terms of like talking about the implications, that last slide sort of really summed it up when we're thinking about economic insecurity being a mainstream condition of Welsh life. This really does matter. It sort of shapes people's everyday lives. It also matters politically because it's obvious that it affects how people vote, how they see the world, their sort of political priorities and their attitudes to like a range of issues around like policy and the constitution. It's also really clear that people who feel and are economically insecure were voting for change in how Wales is governed in the election, and that with them being more likely to be in favour of things like independence, it's really clear that from people's voting preferences that economically insecure people in Wales want to see change from the status quo. And you might say, like, who can blame them, given that sort of common experience people have of that level of worry about theirs and their family's future, which is really understandable. I think also, it's obvious that way too many people in Wales don't feel that they have a stake in politics, and we shouldn't be seeing that many people agreeing with those statements that, it doesn't matter who's in power and that people in power don't listen to people like me. So I think in terms of the implications for everyone that was elected on the 7th of May and all the political parties in Wales and, everyone, I guess, who's involved in sort of politics and public life in Wales, I think, with nearly half the population faced with economic insecurity, that it really needs to be a priority to get to grips with this issue. And, given those findings on how people voted and their attitudes to different issues, that's not just a sort of moral statement or an economic one. It's one that's about political necessity for every political party. They need to be listening to people who feel economically insecure and responding to their worries and their priorities. So I think we would draw out sort of 3 top lessons in terms of how we think that can be done. So firstly, we think it's really important that all political parties address the political priorities of people who are economically insecure. So, looking at those questions we had there about people's spending priorities, that despite some of the media narratives about what people think and that saying that they're opposed to increased public spending, we can see that a lot of people who feel economically insecure want a lot more spending on things like welfare, public transport, things that sort of really shape their day-to-day lives and provide sort of support from the state. So I think it's really important that parties need to reflect on those, on the actual evidence there about people's views if they want to maximise their appeal to voters who feel insecure. Second, if we want to reduce how many people in Wales feel economically insecure, then we need to prioritise policy interventions that are actually going to achieve that. So one thing to note about that is that it should also apply even where those things aren't sort of priorities for the majority of the population. And a good example of that is increasing expenditure on childcare. So the data showed that that was only a priority for about a third of voters, which you maybe expect given that the people who are sort of more affected by it are parents. But due to the fact that we know from some of the work that the Bevan Foundation and others have done, that increasing the provision of funded childcare is one of the most effective tools we have to reduce poverty and the sort of cost of living pressures that people in families are experiencing, then we do think that the new government is totally right to make that a political priority over this Senedd term. And then lastly, probably a specific lesson for Plaid Cymru, that need to focus on policies that reduce economic insecurity. That's very pronounced for them as the new party of government, particularly given the evidence on who voted for them as well. So we know that a lot of the policies that they've committed to, from expanding that funded childcare and things like the Welsh child payment pilot of Cynnal, increasing investment in social housing, those are all things that we know as the Bevan Foundation that will make a real difference to people's everyday lives and those cost of living pressures if they're implemented effectively. And we know that, as Jack was saying, like the Senedd does in general have sort of higher levels of trust among people. But I'd also say that, and most people I think would be aware of this, that trust is probably quite fragile and does need to be, continually built on. Because if those policies that we're talking about that would make a real difference, if they're not implemented in full, and people don't feel like their financial position is getting better over the next few years, there is a risk that those feelings of like anger, worry, disaffection are just going to increase. And that's not only going to be towards the Welsh Government and Plaid Cymru, but that will sort of tend to be towards politics more broadly in Welsh democracy. And like Jack's got a good line in his report, which sort of really sums that up, where he says that economic insecurity and political powerlessness form a mutually reinforcing cycle. So, I think we would probably all agree that it's really important that that cycle is broken. And most of us, who work on these issues can understand why people are worried about their futures, why they feel angry, why they might feel those sort of low levels of political efficacy. But it is really important that the new Welsh Government and everyone who was elected on the 7th of May sort of really focuses now on how the decisions that they can make can improve people's financial circumstances and, as a result, increase people's sense of hope that actually political decisions can and are going to improve their lives over the next few years. I'd say that's those are kind of our main reflections, but it'd be interesting to see if people have questions as well. And you can read, we've got a blog on our website along with the full report where you can read a bit more in depth.
Yeah, diolch Babli. And as Babli said, the report and the blog are available in both Welsh and English on our website. So please make sure to check them out. We've had a few questions through already, which is great. So I'll try and pick up as many as I can, and if you've got any more, please send them through. I'm going to kick off with a question from Thomas Lavery, actually, and I think, Jack, you're probably the one in the best place to answer this. So I think one of the terms that we got used to a lot in the Senedd election campaign was this idea of voting blocks and kind of those blocks being based around national identity. So people who viewed themselves as more Welsh maybe voting for Plaid and Labour and more British voting for Reform and the Tories. And Thomas is asking is whether there's anything within the data that would suggest whether economic insecurity drives people to feel more Welsh or British, or is it other factors that create those identities and they intermingle then around this issue?
It's an excellent question. Well, we used to think national identity was pretty set in your life, right? You didn't really change. You felt Welsh kind of from your socialization as a teenager or something, and then that basically stayed unchanged. We now know that actually your national identity and just all your social identities, which tend to be very deeply held kind of cognitive structures, right? They affect how we see and think about everything. They do react to politics and they do change as a result of politics. So things like the Brexit referendum, for example, made people feel less British in Wales. Didn't change their Welshness, but it made Remainers at least feel a lot less British. In terms of like economic insecurity, um, while I don't think we don't have anything to say that it causes someone to change their national identity, we do know that people who feel economically insecure are slightly more likely to feel Welsh than they are to feel British. Now, it's not huge, and it might, to be honest, be more of a mingling in terms of what age demographics are more likely to feel insecure. So we know that, for example, like millennials as a cohort, as a generation, however you want to define it, are very Welsh. They feel very Welsh. They don't feel very British, and they're also at the moment the most likely to feel insecure because they're hitting that peak of spending everything essentially there. So while there is a slight relationship between national identity and feeling economically insecure, it's probably isn't like one causing the other. It's probably mixed up in this whole bundle of everything else that's going on. But it is a good question, and I think like there is really interesting new research that can be done in the future to look at other kind of economic shocks in someone's life and how that affects their identities and their relationships to the state. It hasn't been done yet, but maybe if we come back in a year or two and I do another webinar, maybe we'll have done it. So I hopefully I can give you a proper answer then.
Diolch, Jack. Yeah, the classic academic answer there. We need more research. Yeah, no, good, interesting. Mabby, if I've got maybe a question that's probably best served for yourself. Yeah, so we've got a couple of questions in here from Stephanie Whitehead, who's asking about, I guess, the role of the third sector in improving feelings around political powerlessness for those feeling financial insecurity. So what, kind of I guess in your response, you focused on the Welsh Government for obvious reasons, but is there something that the third sector could be doing kind of more effectively, you think?
Um, yeah, that's a really good question. And I think I did say I do see this as a responsibility of, all of us who sort of have a role in kind of civic society or public life. But yeah, it is a difficult one. I think yeah, well, as someone who's worked in the third sector for many years, as probably a lot of you on this call have, I think there are like good and bad ways that the third sector can work and can sort of lead its sort of policy and influencing and campaigning work. And I think probably the ways that are most effective, particularly when we're talking about this and increasing people's feelings of like agency and political efficacy, would be where that work is really rooted in everyday people's lives and concerns. And, so trying to maybe move away from that more kind of like top down agenda setting and priorities to making sure that all our work, whatever issues they are that we're working on, then that is really based on evidence in terms of both the data in terms of like what's happening on the ground, and surveys like this, but also sort of work with people in communities and lived experience work and sort of really listening to people about what they think would make a change in their lives. Because I think often those of us who are in these kind of roles and working in charities or campaigns, there's maybe sometimes assumptions about what policy solutions would change an issue, which don't actually reflect what people, I'm thinking particularly for people on sort of low incomes or people who are sort of feeling economically insecure, like what is it they actually think would make the biggest difference to their lives. So yeah, I think always basing our work on that. And also then when we're doing that kind of campaigning and policy and influencing work, trying to involve people in that work as much as possible, and being that link between like the Senedd and political decisions and communities, and trying as much as we can to get people involved and facilitating them to contact their representatives to be involved in kind of campaigns and events or discussions and debates at the Senedd as much as we can.
Yeah, definitely. A question that from an anonymous attendee that possibly more for yourself, Jack, about whether there's any evidence from elsewhere where I guess the government has had success in driving down economic insecurity and then the dynamics on that on political trust. So yeah, any thoughts you've got on that?
Well, these specific measures of economic insecurity, they've only been asked 3 times. So in Scotland, across GB, but mostly England, and then in this report here. So on this specific one, it's a bit harder to say. Um, Now, one thing we do pick up in this data, and it's sort of related, I think it's related to this, is this idea that actually since 2024, perceptions of things like public services have been getting better in Wales. So since 2024, more people think the health service is improving, education is improving, standing of living is actually improving. But if you look, still a majority think it's bad. So it's not improving rapid enough. So there's something there, I think. In terms of looking at countries where essentially I can't answer it in terms of economic security, but I can answer it in terms of things like efficacy and trust. So again, contrary to a lot of narratives, there isn't like a massive crisis of trust in the UK. Trust has fallen over the last 30, 40 years, but not by a huge amount. But if you look at countries with the highest level of trust and also the highest levels of efficacy, and that means that people feel they are part of the political process, they can shape it. And that's true across kind of all the income spectrum. It's always the countries that in these sorts of things everyone points to. So it's Scandinavian countries. And you can point at a few things. The first is that quite a few of them have, well, essentially, you just are more economically secure, right? By almost any measure. The state intervenes in people's lives a lot more, but it also means you get a lot more from the state, literally, in terms of money. Now, you pay a lot more to the state as well, but you do get a lot back. There's things like, if we go back to what people were concerned about here in Wales, the biggest one was the household income. And it wasn't losing their job, it was just that their household income might be eroded or change in some way. The Scandinavian states tend to have actually protections against that, right? There's things like that. But in terms of like the general academic study of welfare states in general, it's always a little bit, not a mystery, but it's a bit unknown why those states just seem to be do better than everyone else. But it could just be as simple as they have a much bigger welfare state, which a higher proportion of society also draws down from. So it isn't just concentrated in people with low incomes, for example, low household incomes. It tends to be across the income spectrum, people are financial beneficiary or get something back from the state. And so that's why things like childcare is a really good policy in targeting these sorts of things, because it's people across income spectrums, across the lifespan, well, not across the entire lifespan, obviously, but things like, grandparents do tend to actually support childcare, because at the moment, more and more grandparents are having to do childcare and pick up on that, right? So that's why kind of policies like that do seem to be able to have some effect on this kind of stuff.
Yeah, Jack. And it raises interesting questions again about revisiting the old universalism versus kind of means tested discussions. Again, kind of that in terms of tight financial kind of circumstances, the inclination is to means test, and we can see that with stuff like the Canal pilot, based on what's done in Scotland, where that's means tested, versus something like free school meals, where that's been expanded on a universal basis. You can see the tensions and the opportunities in doing that as well.
Well, we do pick up on, so I just, like on when we ask about specific welfare spending, if you look at people who feel economically secure, the percentage you think that there should be more spending on unemployment benefits, for example, is zero. Well, it's actually 1%, but I'm going to say that's zero. Nobody thinks they should, because they don't think they're going to be beneficiaries from it. If you look at people who feel economically insecure, and bear in mind, most of these people are working full-time jobs, but they feel economically insecure, it's still low, but it's 20%, it's 20 points higher. So again, yeah, I mean, it feeds into stuff like that. Whereas more universal benefits, things like pensions and health, everybody wants to spend loads more, because everyone thinks they will require it at some point. So yeah, it does feed into those tensions.
Absolutely. I know time is getting the better of us, but I guess, Mably, to bring you back in, maybe the last point to reflect on those tensions is that we know that there's discussions ongoing today in the Senedd on the supplementary budget. I'm just wondering, kind of reflecting on that conversation, any final thoughts from yourself about maybe what are the lessons from this, that if you were sat in the room with Plaid and Labour today, or whoever the parties they may be discussing with, to get that budget through, what would you be saying is the key message from this work to them?
Yeah, I think it is some of the stuff I touched on earlier about really listening to those political priorities of people who feel economically insecure, keeping in mind that is nearly half the population, and prioritizing those measures that are going to make a genuine difference. So, it's something we've talked about in the Bevan Foundation over recent months when it comes to things like tackling cost of living pressures and poverty, that to prioritize those large scale impactful measures like universal funded childcare, like increasing investment and provision of social housing, things that are going to make the biggest difference to huge numbers of people and really change their experiences on a day-to-day basis. So yeah, I think that's probably what I would say.
Well, hopefully, some of those people in the room listen to you, Mably, and we get a positive kind of outcome through that process. That's it in terms of our time for this morning. So, just wanted to thank all of you for coming along, and particularly Jack and Mably for all their time and contribution. As I said, the report and the blog are available on our website, and a recording of this session will be available there shortly as well. So for those of you, I've seen a couple of messages about people having to join later. That will be there for you. Otherwise, we look forward to hearing from you again in the near future. And yeah, diolch yn fawr.